I want to talk about three different views of what the ego is and how the spiritual search attempts to undermine the ego based on each of these views. Now, any view of the ego, any kind of theory, we have to start with this fact that it is not quite true. Any doctrine, any theory about the ego is not quite true. All the doctrines about the ego, and about the self for that matter, are in the language, in the categories of the ego. That is to say, they are based on the idea of subject-object duality. So take it with a grain of salt. They're useful for a seeker to have some idea of what's going on, some theory, a little theory, just to sort of orient themselves. So the first view I'm going to call of the ego is the static view of the ego. That's the simple idea that when you experience anything, right, be it an outside perception, a sight or sound, or something you taste, touch, or smell, or something you think or feel, imagine, or desire, anything in your memory, all of those experiences are objects. They're objects because they're bounded, meaning that they come and go, they have limitations in time and space. And the key thing to notice is that when you experience an object, you don't just know the object, you know the subject. The subject is that sense of I. That sense of I that is drawn in distinction to the object. That is, the object, the experience, is not I. So there's I, which is the subject, experiencing, but not I. Every time an experience arises, both of these poles arise, the object and the subject. And what is this subject exactly? Well, it turns out that the subject is this mass of unexamined assumptions about who you are. The idea that you're an experiencer, the idea that you're a doer, and far more than that, actually, that you're a person, that you're a body, that you have certain, that you were born, that you have a family, that you have a career, that you have relationships, certain kinds of desires and dislikes and likes, and just this whole panoply of cultural and personal stuff that's not very examined. This all forms part of your relatively unexamined view of who you are. At the heart of that, at the center of that, is this mysterious I. The I is sort of clothed in all those assumptions, which is why you have the idea in Hindu Vedantic theory of the koshas or sheaths. That is, the mind is considered a set of like an onion, like a set of skins built on top of each other. The outside is the body, and then inside is emotions, and then within that is the intellect, and then within that is a sort of pure sense of I. So the static idea of the ego is that sense of the subject which arises in relationship to the object and which contrasts itself to the object. And it is the purpose, let's say, of self-inquiry, to penetrate through the mass of unexamined assumptions about what the I is, namely that it's a body, etc., to notice that all of those things which you thought are the subject are actually themselves objects. So when you pierce through with self-inquiry and you notice that all the things that you think you were are actually objects, well, what remains at the very end? When the I, which is torn away from all the objects that it thinks it is isolated, it can't stand on its own because the I is defined by contrast. And contrast is a function of being an object, not a subject. So the I is separated from all those objects. What happens? It can't stand, and its illusory character is seen. So this is a static view of the ego. Then there's a dynamic view of the ego. What is a dynamic view of the ego? The dynamic view of the ego is that sense of the ego that arises from the motion of thought. What is thought, after all? Is thought a single thing like, oh, I have this experience right now? No. Experience is always flowing like a river. It's always in contrast to what came before and what's immediately coming after. You're always in movement. And the movement of thought is united by the sense of I-ness. It is the same I, supposedly, that knows the thought and experience from a moment ago and will know it a moment from now. And it's a sense of the thoughts being cognized or experienced by the same I that gives a sense of the ego. That's the dynamic view of the ego. And the dynamic view of the ego lends itself to metaphors like the idea of, this is used in some of the scriptures, like a torch that you whirl around and it seems to create a circle. Or as I like to say sometimes, a flip book that you know, like an old-fashioned kind of little flip book where you flip the pages and you see motion. So when you think about this dynamic view of the ego, which is generated by the sense of a stable subject over time that is through the motion of thought, because it must be the same subject that is experiencing these different thoughts, the solution here is to slow thought down. To slow thought down and preferably to stop thought. Because when you stop that motion, the thing that seemed to be bridging them, that seemed to be generated by the movement of thought, that thing also seems to slow down or stop. And that can happen through any concentration practice, but of course, Ramana Maharshi recommends, and I recommend, surrender and self-inquiry. That also attacks the dynamic view of ego. Then there's a third and final view. These are not exclusive. I'm sure there are other views, but the third view that I'll be talking about right now is what I would call the structural view, which is the content of thought and of the narrative is all with reference to this I, this self-image. The content of thought and desire is based on this identity of being an I. And all the thoughts refer to that I, and they, for validity, refer to the other thoughts that also refer to the I. So all the thoughts kind of are talking about the same I entity. And they say, hey, I'm not the only one thinking about this I entity. All the other thoughts are saying the same thing, so it must be true. So the I then arises as a structural feature of thought. And this is where metaphors of the idea of the dream, the illusion metaphor, the idea of seeing a snake, but it's actually a rope, which is a very famous metaphor from Vedanta, right? These kinds of illusion metaphors, these kinds of direct pointings are talking about this structural aspect of thought. That recursive nature, all the thought is all referencing each other, and they're all referencing each other's reference of the I. So it all seems like the I must exist. It's given validity by the structure, the content of thought, and of mutual, interdependent validation. So that's challenged through these pointers that thou art that, for example, famous pointer from Vedanta. Thou art that, meaning you are the essence of things beyond thought. Beyond all the changeable things, there is an essence. Beyond all the changeable things out there, and beyond all the changeable things, quote unquote, in here, there is a single essence, and that you are. These are not addressed purely to logic, these pointers. They are trying to point out something which is piercing thought, piercing the structure of thought, pointing out the structure, the mutually reinforcing structure of thought and trying to point out something, a different perspective within which that whole structure is suddenly seen as a structure and as an illusion. So, briefly, 3 views of the ego: static, which is the subject as contrasted to the object, the I as contrasted to the not I, which is sort of pierced through using self-inquiry and surrender. Of course, I mean, all of these are pierced through using self-inquiry and surrender. The dynamic, which is the sense of the ego or I generated by the motion of thought. Oh, there's something stable across time, across thought, which is countered by slowing oneself down. So in the static version, you are examining who is the I, and you're cutting out the things that you think the I is. In the dynamic, you are slowing thought down, because then the illusion of the ego and the I that goes with the motion of thought is also slowed down. And in the structural, you're asking that question, the unanswerable question, the question that cannot be answered in logic, which is, once you've obtained, a certain piercing through the static and a certain slowing down of thought through the dynamic, then to ask that final question, like, who am I? What is the nature of all this, right? The question that cannot be understood within thought, because thought itself is the prison which is to be understood. And that's the penetration through the structural. So this is just a very, very brief theoretical overview of 3 viewpoints on the ego and how spiritual practice is meant to deal with them, in brief. I'll be revisiting these topics in future videos.